And welcome to this episode of Done and Dusted. I'd like to introduce and welcome my fellow poddy, that's short for podcaster, Caroline Counsel of Caroline Counsel Family Lawyers. As we all know, I'm not only fabulous, but an accredited family law specialist. And our special guest tonight is Georgina Dimopoulos. And Dimopoulos. I'm terrible with those names, aren't I, Georgina? You always have a go at me with that. It's my Aussie heritage, unfortunately, though I do wish to come back as a Greek one day. But in any event, Georgina Dimopoulos is here. She is, I should call her doctor. She is a senior lecturer in law at Southern Cross University, and she researches across the areas of family law, children's rights, privacy, and family violence. She has a PhD in law, something I don't have. She has a Bachelor of Law, first class honours there, and a Bachelor of Arts in Media and Communication. So therefore, that means she is very well qualified to be on this program. Not only that, I had the pleasure of going to Georgina's launch of her book called Decisional Privacy and the Rights of the Child. And that was in December last year. You had Justice Josh Wilson there. Launching that book for you. And this book presents as a new model enabling and listening to children's voices in decision-making processes. And it uses the Australian family law jurisdiction and the medical treatment for children with gender dysphoria as a case study. And the aim of that book is to give adult decision makers an opportunity to reflect on how they make decisions for and about children and how children can play a more meaningful role in those decision-making processes. Now, that's quite a mouthful, Georgina. So I want you to help me and the viewers, not Caroline so much because she knows all this. I want you to help us break it down a bit. What's it all about?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Darren and Caroline, and thanks for inviting me onto your program. So I wrote this book because I think children's ability to participate in a meaningful and a safe way in decision-making and adult decision-makers being able to listen to and hear children's voices and take them seriously, they're ongoing areas of concern, not just in family law and medical treatment, which is the focus of my book, but in different jurisdictions, both within and beyond Australia. And often absent from public debate and discussion about children are the voices of children themselves. So we can see, as a few examples, children's activism in response to climate change, the impact of COVID-19 school closures and lockdowns. They're just a couple of examples beyond family law that show the importance of grappling with how to engage children more meaningfully in decision-making and how to better enable and listen to children's voices. So the aim of the book is really to encourage more discussion about the importance of listening to children and taking what they have to say seriously. And as you said, Darren, giving adults the opportunity to think about how they might modify their decision-making processes so that they become child-centred, child-inclusive, and give children the opportunity to feel that they have been heard.
Yeah, and in your work, Caroline, how do you find it best, because you've been doing this for a long time, how do you find it best to modify the way parents might listen to children and act accordingly?
Well, I think the focus has to be on the child. So what I love about Georgina and the work that she's done is literally flipped it on the head from, what do the adults care about? What do the adults want to see have happen? But instead, let's actually listen to the children. Let's hear from them. And I find it very strange, Georgina and Darren, that we're in an era whereby children are so empowered to be at the table. They're given every opportunity and encouragement. And if you will, their upbringing is all about finding their voice. But then you get to this sticky wicket called separation. And suddenly all the control leeches away from these potentially potent people that know what they want and want to see things happen. And it's thrust back upon the parents. And the parents then become, I think, overly involved in what they want to see happen. And they clothe it often with, oh, I think this is what's best for our children, or worse still, my children. So, Darren, it's really about saying, particularly the clients that don't get it, that aren't really understanding what's going on for their kids, imagining, just sit back and imagine what this must be like for your daughter, your son, your children. Think about things that they've said, and maybe there's a different interpretation. Maybe even though they are the words they use, maybe what they really want to see is not what you want, but something different. And just working with them through the fact that there might be another outcome that they haven't even thought about yet.
Yeah, are these sort of what you're talking about, Caroline? Georgina, if I can throw to you, are these helicopter parents that interpret what the children, what they perceive, what they want, and then go on their own merry tangent? I think there was a song by Joan Armatradge, Drop the Pilot. Maybe a few of these parents need to get rid of the pilots on these helicopters. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think spot on what you said, Caroline and Darren, about whether we label them helicopter parents or something else. But really, the what's come out of the research in the work that I do as well is that in the family law domain, as you've said, in other domains, we want to promote children's agency, their autonomy, their evolving capacities. And then when it comes to family law, we say, no, we need to protect you from participation. And then we say, look, it will be harmful to children to get them involved. I think that's quite naive that children wouldn't appreciate and understand their parents' conflict and actually want to express a view and their wishes about who they might want to live with and spend time with. And also, another view that often is put forward, advanced against involving children in family law decision making is that it might promote irresponsible decisions by parents. And how do we know that it's genuinely the child's voice and the child hasn't been coached or influenced or feel that they might suffer negative consequences if they express a preference, for living with mum or dad. So as you said, I think the separated parents often lose focus on the child in the context of their dispute, and then we lose the child's voice.
Sure. But as Caroline said before, and I think it was really important, a lot of children are speaking out more and more these days. And if you're a fan of social media platforms like I am, if you go to TikTok, it seems, and I'm generalizing here, but there are a lot of children letting it be known that they're not actually their biological gender. That they want to trans into a female or a male. And some of these kids that appear on these social platforms look like they're 10 or 11 years of age. And I'm just wondering, what do you think, Caroline, in terms of, are we giving the children too much of a voice?
Well, look, you've got to be very careful, of course, during that developmental period. I'm not a child psychologist, but you have to listen to the experts. You have to take on board what it is that the child is saying, and saying in safe spaces, not in that pressure cooker environment. So imagine how hard it is anyway to grapple with one's identity, and then add to that a separation between your parents, and add to that decision making that's been taken away from you. So as Georgina said, what we have to do is recognise children have agency. And this is what I love about the work that Darren does and I've done as an independent children's lawyer, about making sure that in the wedge between mums and dads, the voice of the child is actually taken seriously into account. I think if you add gender dysphoria into the mix, it is another layer of complication, but as might any other developmental complication be. And for example, I think of learning disabilities. I think of health challenges that children face. I think of any number of developmental aspects of a child's life that parents really, you get one chance to get it right. So why wouldn't you then take on board all the expertise before, and why wouldn't you include the other parent before saying, look, and the child most of all, before saying this is the path we should go down? Imagine going down the wrong path and simply out of arrogance, ignorance, or my way or the highway attitudes as parents.
Yeah, it's such a complex area, and as you rightly said, Caroline, we're not psychologists, we're not biologists, and certainly when it comes to hormonal therapy and things of that nature, there's significant fallout from it if you get it wrong. What I'd like to know, Georgina, I'm really interested. You know, it's really weird. Carol and I have been doing family law for a long time, obviously, but we don't often quote in court the United Nations Convention when it comes to the rights of a child. I know the Act has some solid base where that, which other things spring from, but we don't actually embrace it. I could count on one hand how many times I've mentioned that in court. And it becomes even more important when we've got things like we're talking about now, gender dysphoria and things when it concerns children. Would you like to make a comment on that? Because I know it's touched on, or not more than touched on, in your fine book. So, yeah, what do you say about that?
Sure. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that about the convention and how it's used in court. I've recently done some more research, which will be published soon in the Australian Journal of Family Law, which was a study that looked at all the published judgments of the family courts from 1990 to 2021, where they referred to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And, you know, unsurprisingly, there weren't many of them. A lot of them were just referring to that additional object of Part 7, which says to give effect. An additional object of this part of the Act is to give effect to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And one of the key findings from this study that I did was that judges have shown quite a lot of skepticism about the relevance and the use of the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Part 7 proceedings. So
What do you think that is?
Look, I think it's because one view might be that judges or legal practitioners or others in the system feel that the convention is already embedded in court processes. So some of the provisions that currently exist about meaningful relationship with both parents, prioritising protection of children from harm and abuse, and other rights and best interests principle are already in the Act. And another could be that because the additional object about giving effect to the convention, it's made clear that it's only relevant if there's a legislative ambiguity. So judges can't, given that the convention isn't part of domestic, it hasn't been incorporated into Australian domestic law, that judges feel, well, it's not, you know, of direct use to their decision making about best interests.
And therefore it follows that they don't really have to worry about the voice of the child, because the convention makes it clear that the child's interests, needs and preferences should be taken into account. But that seems to get lost in the wash. And I think it's really been sort of tick a box with independent children's lawyers, because it's not guaranteed that children will have the independent children's lawyer in every single case. And unfortunately, Georgina, that came down to money. It came down to governments not wanting to fund, the federal government in particular, but also the Victorian government through Victorian legal aid, not wanting to fund independent children's lawyers in every single matter. And yet, if we are signatories to the convention, you would think, therefore, logically, there should be an independent children's lawyer in every single matter, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And also following on from that about, you know, the often in some research has found that in some cases, the independent children's lawyer doesn't even meet with the child whose interests they're meant to be representing. And so, you know, we see with the proposed family law reforms that one of the proposed changes to the Act is that the independent children's lawyer must meet with the child. I mean, my view of that is that that obligation or that new duty on the independent children's lawyer doesn't actually equate to the child exercising their right under the convention to participate in the proceedings.
It goes part of the way, but not all the way. And don't you think it's bizarre when you think about the Act has been enforced since, 1975, and it's had all sorts of amendments and things, paramount interest, best interest. But don't you think it's weird that now here we are in 2023, and we have to look at or consider, the Attorney General has to consider putting in such an order, such a thing into the Act, that independent children's lawyers must speak to children. I mean, how bizarre is that?
And if I may, Darren, didn't it really frustrate you when judges changed tack in relation to our role as independent children's lawyer? So I think it'd be absolutely fascinating to follow that history through cases, Georgina. And you clearly have a fabulous search engine. If you're able to pick apart cases from 1990 and find keywords. Once upon a time, we always met with the child. We always did, but it's not a strict representative role. And this is where I think the adults get confused. So are we surprised that a child who wants to exercise their own agency, it must be even more confusing for the child. They meet somebody or are told that somebody is representing them, but in fact, they're not really representing the voice of the child. They're not really representing the view of the child. They are putting before the court the evidence to enable the court to make a decision. But it was judges who basically queried the credentials of independent children's lawyers to meet their clients. And that's what led to the spiral of independent children's lawyers saying, I'm not prepared to meet, or I'm not going to meet.
Yeah, that's right.
Except in certain situations, such as in the presence of the family report writer, or in the presence of the treating child psychologist.
Right.
But with adults who honestly, sometimes in family law matters, don't know how to best convey themselves to their own lawyer, we meet them. So what is the difference? And that's one of the challenges, Georgina, and I'm really glad that you've highlighted this
it's fantastic
issue for decision makers to seriously think about, how do you get the views of the child across? How is the child heard?
Exactly. And the difficulty for us is that we've only got Georgina for a short time. So Georgina Dimopoulos, who wrote this book, Decisional Privacy and the Rights of a Child, how do we get this book if we want to have a read of it? Because I think it's a must read for all us family law practitioners out there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so if you Google it, Decisional Privacy and the Rights of the Child, you can buy a hard copy, or an ebook's available as well. So thanks for the plug.
It really sounds, not at all. I mean, it sounds fantastic. As I said, I went to the opening, and it's very topical, and it's an extension, for me anyhow, Georgia, it's an extension of the work that was done by the Australian Institute of Family Studies by, now you know her, Rachel.
Yeah, Rachel Carson. Yes.
Yeah, excellent, big fan of her. She's great. So thank you for coming on, but we're not going to let you go just yet, because I can't believe this, Caroline, but all the letters we received during the week, it's very nice that people actually wrote in these letters of thanks. But we got a few letters too that wanted to be read out, so we might be able to assist them. So can I say we'll do our best? So this one, I've cut out the names of people, so they can't be identified. And unfortunately, Georgina, as we discovered from last week, this is the best you'll get with the facts. We haven't got any other facts than these. So put your thinking hats on, girls, and here we go. All right, it says, Dear Done and Dusted, my ex, Sally, and I are in the middle of a family law bust-up. It's been pretty hard to bear, and I didn't see it coming. I don't think the kids are coping all that well. We have twins. The boy's Jake, 13. He'll be 14 in August. And Rachel. Jake has been diagnosed with mild autism, but I think the teachers and the doctors are just keen to pin a label on him. He's a good kid, but a bit slow at reading and writing. He struggles at school, and he has dyslexia. I was not academic, and there's nothing wrong with that. I got a good apprenticeship as a sparky, and work has been crazy busy. I make good money. Sally went to uni, and I reckon she wants the kids to go to uni, even if it's not right for them. Sally has started back as a teacher 3 days a week. We split the time week about. We have a younger daughter, Irma. She's a funny kid. probably because of her name. No, I shouldn't say that. A bit quiet since we split. She prefers staying over with her sister and has 3 kids. And her 3 kids when she is supposed to be with me. And my sister Sam says the same happens when she has her week with Sally. Sally wants to change schools and get an aid for Jake, and it makes and make me pay for tutors. I think it's overkill. Jake says he likes his school because of his mates. Jake and Rachel used to be peas in a pod, and now they've got older. They're not as close. I don't want to go to court, but I can see a change of school as just the start of their mum making up her mind. We don't talk much. And we've been in mediation at some community place, but as usual, because I didn't roll over for what she wants, it has to go back to court. Signed off, Mike. So, a fairly, not an unusual factual scenario that we see from Mike, is it, Caroline?
No, it's fairly typical, unfortunately, and it's sad because the ability of this couple, there's still a couple of parents. They may not be a couple in love, but they've got a lot of heavy lifting to do in relation to their kids. And you kind of sort of wonder, this is Mike's view. I'd really love to hear Sally's view, but we haven't got that, of course. But you've got little Irma that seems to be falling through the gaps and skating away from both of them. Maybe a bit of duck for cover. The son, sorry, what's his name again?
Jake.
Jake. So Jake seems to be sharing a bit with Dad, which is good. Like, he talks about school and his mates and what have you. I'm wondering what's going on for Rachel. So it's already that invisibility, if you will, Georgina and Darren, of children in the parent lens that's put across, this is our life as we know it. This is what I think's going on as Dad. So I'd be fascinated to see what the kids actually say is going on for them, wouldn't you, Georgina?
Can I say this? Being a parent myself, it is such a hard decision to know where to send your child to school. And it's, and it's not only parents, it's aunties and uncles and grandparents, all sorts of people weigh into this. What's the best school for their little treasure? And it seems Jake here, he's talking to his dad, but I get the feeling from this letter that Sally wants the best education possible for the kids. And I'd like to know from her, and we don't know, whether it matters to her whether Jake ends up doing a trade, such as a Sparky. We don't really know that, but it's a bit of a dilemma. What's your take on it, Georgina, as far as the kids are concerned?
Yeah, I would, to reiterate the point that Caroline said, I think, what we see is missing here is, what do the children think? What do they want? And that's really, there's a few comments in there that stand out as red flags to me about, tension between the parents about, diagnosing Jake with mild autism and dyslexia. Mike, Dad, says nothing wrong with that. Sally being, and, wanting the children to have that formal education. And also just, as you said, Irma, in a way, voting with her feet and not wanting to stay with either parent. That was something. Obviously, this has gone through mediation and hasn't been to court, but just some findings recently from some research by the Australian Institute of Family Studies found that a reason for non-compliance with parenting orders is that children themselves were choosing not to comply. They weren't happy with the orders. They felt that the orders weren't accommodating their changing needs. They didn't want to stay with mum or didn't want to stay with dad, whatever the order provided. And that is something that that report has said, well, if we listen to children more in the process of making orders and coming to these arrangements for parenting or for matters like schooling, it might encourage compliance with orders. I mean, Darren, the issue of, changing schools is a tough one. I've recently moved with my family from up to the Gold Coast, and I had to, pick a school for my 2 kids who are at primary school. And, I think, I've picked one, hope for the best. At the moment they're enjoying it, but it's, it's a really tough decision. And, I can see that.
I hope you brought sunshade hats up there for them.
Yeah, we have, yeah.
And Georgina, we often also see parents trying to put into concrete arrangements for kids so far in the future that who knows what the school is going to be like in 7 years' time when one of the children might be ready to start there. So I always find that very strange that they get wedded, and it's worse when you're potentially dealing with people who had a great experience of their own school, and possibly in certain pockets, socioeconomic pockets, you get people wedded because it's the alma mater. That's where I went to school, and it's a damn fine school, and little Johnny's going to wear the uniform. So rather than say, who is this child that's before us? What are their needs? What are their real needs? What are their actual needs? Are those needs going to be met? Are those needs even aligned with what the child's needs are? Which is really the conversation, Georgina, I think you're trying to encourage all of us to think about, the bit of the conversation that's missing.
And the other, and I was just going to say also, with Jake having been diagnosed with mild autism and having dyslexia, we need to be careful that because of that, we don't dismiss what he has to say and what his views are, and say, look, just because he does have these learning disabilities, that doesn't mean that his views and what he wants should be any lesser than any other child. So just acknowledging that all children's voices should be respected as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The other thing that I got out of this, and maybe I'm being a bit harsh on Mike, but I felt there's a little bit of self-projection that, I'm a tradie, I did all right, I wasn't the brightest spark in the, excuse the pun, brightest spark or the smartest, the sharpest tool in the shed. But I get the impression that he says, well, I don't see the big deal for Jakey. He can go along. He doesn't have to go to one of these, whiz-bang schools or universities or whatever. But it's surprising, though, because my son, and I won't mention what school he went to, but a lot of his mates did VCE and ended up doing trades. I couldn't believe how many. But the parents in those cases joined, probably knowing that their sons weren't going to go up to university, but effectively bought them networks,
But it's also that preconceived idea about who I am. The children are a projection of me. They're not individuals in their own right. And you have that, there's almost a very subtle, or maybe it's very obvious, competition between Mike and Sally. And whilst Mike hasn't reflected on one of the reasons why the marriage fell apart, you'd have to imagine it's because they are very different people. And so Sally's ambition for the children is different from Mike's ambition, and quite possibly, Darren, whether Mike's preparing Jake for something that he perceives even to be a bit of a failure in his own world. It's sort of like, don't aim high, don't be the best you can be academically. And it is okay. It's okay to pursue a trade. There is nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Mike pats himself on the back and says, look, I'm making a ton of money, which is great. And Sally, university educated, because her life's been on the back burner to have children. She's working 3 days a week, hopefully with a view, if she wants to increase that to 5. But I just feel that I think there's a tension that's the parental tension now playing out in relation to how are we going to parent these 3 children, and maybe a bit of undue focus on Jake, only because he's the squeaky wheel at the moment. I'm kind of sort of worried about what I mentioned Irma before, but who's Rachel?
Who's Rachel?
Exactly. Who is she? And what are her needs, and what does she need as a young teen becoming a woman? What are her needs, and how are they being met, and are they even focusing on that?
How many affidavits do you read in the family court, and how many judgments, for that matter, where you finish your reading and you've got no idea really what the child's about, unless they've got some condition like autism or ADHD, or they've got one leg or something like that. you don't get it for a court that focuses on children's best interest. You don't get a flavour of that, do you? Sometimes, you know.
And I was going to say, Caroline, something you said made my eyes light up. I think you must have read my book, because you mentioned about children having rights and interests that are distinct from those of their parents, and that's something that often is overlooked. And if we take a child rights approach to a case study like this, we need to, consider that Jake and Sally and Irma are individuals, and Jake might not end up being like his father, and we don't know anything about Rachel. I mean, the one thing that interests me is why Mike has made the comment that Jake and Rachel used to be peas in a pod, but now they're not as close. I mean, why they've drifted apart, is it just the fact that they're getting older? Sort of that's the extent of what we know about Rachel. But also, as you said, parents not projecting their their dreams and their aspirations onto their children, but respecting them for who they are as individuals.
Yeah, and that's a really important word, Georgina, individuals, because they are all individuals, all individual and unique wants, desires, hopes. And sometimes we see in the courts that children are forgotten about in a SIB ship, or their needs and wants are minimised and prioritised by the parents' own needs. But look, I could talk about this all night, but I can't, because Caroline will whip me. And she's given me this chair tonight, Georgina. You see, we're supposed to be swapping chairs each week. And I kind of like this, because for once in my life, I've got control over Caroline. You see? But honestly, it's been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed this session. But can you give us a parting comment, Georgina, in terms of what we've been discussing? Voice of children, decisional privacy, things of that nature. Give a little handout to our audience.
Yeah, I think just to focus on the child's best interests, and to understand that doing what's in the child's best interest means involving the child in the decision making to the extent that they want to be involved in a meaningful and safe way. So prioritising children's voices to the extent that they want to participate.
Beautiful. What about you, Caroline?
Much the same. Turn down that parental laser lens of intensity on your children. Stop, take notice. Who are they? Who are my kids? What do they need from me? What's my job now as a separated parent? How can I make their life a little easier, not more complicated?
Yeah. Well, my closing comment would be, if you're in the helicopter, make sure you listen to the kids before you land, and don't drop the pilot. All right. This week's episode of Done and Dusted is done and dusted. I'd like to thank our very, very special guest, Georgina Dimopoulos, for being here tonight. Her insight has been incredible and very enjoyable, and I've learned heaps. And of course, my co-poddy, Caroline Counsel, the one and only, thank you for joining us tonight too. And we will say goodbye for this episode, and we'll be back next week. Thank you.
Bye, Darren.